Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
And we're thrilled that our next guest is coming on the show. I just mentioned to him, amazingly, that this is the first time that I've ever spoken to him. And that kind of defies logic, really. He's a wonderful journalist and filmmaker. And you will have seen his films. And we're going to talk specifically about JFK Jr. We're going to talk about the assassination of JFK Jr. We're going to talk about that. But also his outstanding film, his outstanding films even on the assassination of JFK Sr. Check out bushkilledjfk.com or thedarklegacy.com. There are contact details there for our next guest as well. Terrific that he's on the show. Let's welcome to the programme John Hankey. And John, it's a special thanks to you for coming on because you've been under the weather a bit lately.
Well, you know, Los Angeles, if it's 45 degrees, it's freezing. That's as cold as it gets.
Yeah, we've had snow and ice and everything in Manchester.
That's what I hear.
In the northwest of England. So you're not going to get too much sympathy here, my friend. I meant what I said to you off air. When I saw the assassination of JFK Jr., it's one of the best, most incredibly well-researched films I've ever seen in my life. It really is, my friend. It's absolutely terrific. And I want to say this. When I was talking to a really good friend of mine about guests that I should be inviting on the programme imminently, she said to me, have you had John Hankey on? I said, I can't believe it. I should have had John on in the past, but I've not. And she said, get him on. And then she said to me, isn't it incredible, Richie, that programmes like yours, how little time they spend talking about JFK Jr. And this is true, John. In the independent media, in the alternative media, whatever you want to call it, or the media, as Patrick Henningsen would say, it's all the media now. We don't spend a lot of time talking about JFK Jr. And his murder is vitally important to talk about in terms of understanding where we are today. I guess you'd agree with that because you made the outstanding film about him.
Well, you know, I've been at this for a long time, right? And I asked you how you got a hold of me, and you mentioned
I mentioned Jim.
Fetzer.
Yeah.
And, you know, Dr. Fetzer has, I don't remember, I guess 10, 15 years ago, he started suggesting that the Zapruder film had been altered. And don't let me lose the thread of this. The point is that it's really, 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 really hard to know what the takeaway is supposed to be, no matter how much you dig and dig and dig and dig. For example, the Kennedy assassination. Here you are 50 years later, and Jim had been talking about this, and I just sort of ignored it as I ignore anything if I can't get through the first layer of the cui bono, right? Who benefited? Why was this done? What was the point? And Jim was pointing out things in the Zapruder film that had been altered, but it didn't make any sense to me. It didn't make any sense to me. Why would you alter that film and leave in the shot from the front? And, you know, I do a whole lot of video editing, and I guess I'm taking you down a road I didn't give you the least bit of money that we were headed to. But, I mean, come on, this is really substantive, and let's start off with the substantive, which is that if you have this little detail and that little detail, or even this major detail or that major thing that shows that the story that we're being told is a lie, it doesn't necessarily get you anywhere. And I have not been successful. I mean, you said there's hardly anybody who talks about JFK Jr. I don't know if you are familiar with Gary Webb, but there's nobody in the alternative media who talk about Gary Webb. And you can ask me about that if you want to. But I can't get anybody to show any interest in discussing why the Zapruder film would have been altered. And then they leave in the headshot. And let me fill in just a little bit because it's short and easy and very much to the point, which is that the limo came to us. It slowed to 1 mile an hour for 20 seconds at least. This is what the motorcycle cops, there's at least 4 motorcycle cops who have recorded interviews in which they describe this and how Secret Service agents dismounted from the vehicle, which was immediately behind the limousine, and came forward along the sides of the limousine, and none of that is in the Zapruder film. And that's the major alteration. But I can also tell you, I mean, especially if you watch JFK 2, I do a lot of monkeying around, right? I mean, how do you illustrate something when you're describing something that's been suppressed in the media? Of course, there aren't visual images. readily at hand to illustrate that. So I end up making a lot of my own graphics. And I have some familiarity with that. And I can tell you that if you were to ask me how I'm going to eliminate a limousine stop, and, if you tell me that you want me to do this, I'm going to tell you that I want 6 months, because first I have to figure out how the hell are you going to do it. And I think they must have had the limousine drive down an empty street in the days before
and filmed it.
Assassination. They had to have had that in their pocket to be able to have eliminated the limousine stop. But to take the shot from the front and turn it into a shot from the rear, I could do that in an afternoon. Me by myself, you give me 10 hours, and I think they had like 35 hours from the time they got the film until they handed over the final versions. And it might have been slightly more, slightly less, and it doesn't matter. The point is, the stunning question is, why would they hand us this film? I don't remember whether Lyndon Johnson was dead or not. It would be right at the borderline of Johnson's death that they handed the film to Garrison with this, very, very clear, clearly incriminating piece of information that could have so simply been altered. And so it has this major alteration, and then it doesn't have the critical alteration, or what you might think was the critical alteration. So that my point is that, what are we now? 52 years after the Kennedy assassination, 52 and a half.
53 this year, yeah.
We're working on it. I don't think anybody has a clue about what the hell. They certainly don't have a clue about the Warren Commission and what was going on with the Warren Commission. I don't think. And, I regard Jim Fetzer as a dear friend and just, a giant.
Oh, great guy, Jim. Yeah. Lovely guy.
Yeah. Of courage and so on. But he and I, 53 years later, he and I disagree very, very sharply about a number of issues. So I don't think, people talk about case closed and whatnot. And
there's no harm in that, John. There's no harm in the disagreements. That's a very scientific way of approaching it. You should
absolutely.
Disagree. And
absolutely.
Do you know, I want to. I'll ask you one question before we talk about JFK Jr. What's your thoughts then? Because the independent media seem to be divided on the place of the Zapruder film in the whole story. Was it deliberate? Was the Zapruder thing a ruse? I mean, was it deliberately filmed by those who murdered Kennedy, or was Zapruder a genuine man who captured this amazing sequence of events? What do you think?
Well, let me tell you what I know and see what you think, which is that I have video of, I don't remember the guy's name, but he was the chief counsel for, I think, the House investigation into the Kennedy estate. Blakey, his name is Robert Blakey. And he, on the stand under oath, he says that there were no Secret Service agents in that area, in the area of Dealey Plaza. And yet Zapruder handed the film over to a Secret Service agent. Now, you would have thought the place would be swarming with FBI and Dallas police, and that's who you would hand the film over to if you were going to hand it over to anyone. But somehow he got it into the hands of a Secret Service agent, which, according to Blakey, should have been very, very difficult under the circumstances that there were none in the area. That's one. Two is that I think it was on a Sunday afternoon. It wasn't the day of the assassination by any means. I don't think, and I could be mistaken, and it doesn't matter. You can find it on the internet. You don't have to look very hard. He, at one point, was rushed to I'm thinking maybe it was the day of the assassination, because the reporter was coming in with all of these news flashes and whatnot. And it's very, very clear that the reporter didn't understand, why are you bringing me this guy? What is he going to tell me that we haven't already heard from any number of people? And, why is he a special witness? And in any case, they bring him in, and he sits down and describes the president's brains gushing from a wound in his forehead.
Wow. I mean, taking that as fact, John, it kind of confirms. It doesn't confirm, because I don't know for a fact, but it leads me to think that the Zapruder film was part of the greater conspiracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt about it. That's what
to me, there's no doubt whatsoever.
Yeah.
Well, and then you find out that when we get it, it's been vastly altered. So, but the question is, why did they give it to us? And why did they make it? And I think that one of the reasons that they made it was that they wanted to terrorize every future president of the United States.
And at the same time terrorize the people of the country, because, we often talk about mind control and trauma on this program. Maybe, one of those added advantages, I think you're right, they wanted to send a message out to, future socialists and socially minded politicians. This is what happens if you, start talking about issuing greenback currency and taking on the Fed. This is what happens to you. But John, I sometimes wonder, were they trying to terrorise the nation by showing it to them? Put people in a state of trauma and fear, because it is, I remember seeing it when I was a young boy. It's a terrifying thing to see when you see it first.
Well, I didn't see it till I was 22, I think.
Yeah.
And I wasn't terrorized. It really, really radicalized me. Before then, I had campaigned for McGovern when he was running for president. And I don't know that I campaigned for another Democratic candidate after I saw the Zapruder film, because I did. And for me, when you have this question of why did they do it, and you can't come up with an answer, my fallback is that you look at what did happen. What was the effect? And it might, it's always a danger of ascribing too much power to these guys. I think they screw up big time, and that they do things that have unintended consequences. But if you don't have another answer, I think that asking what was the effect, and I think that the effect was to disenfranchise probably millions of people from the Democratic Party, because when you see the Zapruder film and you look at the Warren Commission report, you lay the blame at the feet of Lyndon Johnson. Well, of course, Lyndon Johnson must have been involved in the assassination. And we're not talking about John Kennedy Jr., and I don't know that we need to. And I think it is not the most important of the murders between the father and the son. Of course
not. But we just don't ever. We never talked about it on this program, and I'm fascinated by it. And the listeners, we're a live program. We've verifiably tens of thousands of listeners. Our Twitter feed at the moment has gone crazy with people tweeting about this, about the Zapruder film. Anybody wants to follow what's being said on Twitter, by the way, you need to put Richie Allen Show, all one word, into the search Twitter bar, click enter, and you'll see what everybody else is saying. It's extraordinary. But I watched your film, The Assassination of JFK Jr. It's fantastic, and I'm watching it. And there are a couple of things which will always stay with me. And that's when you reveal, and you talk about it in the notes with the DVD, you talk about it. We know that George H.W. Bush is one of the few people alive, or who was alive when Kennedy was murdered, who says he doesn't remember where he was that day. It's extraordinary. George Bush's father, of course, later went on to head up the CIA. He can't remember where he was when on November the 22nd, 63. What's incredible, and I didn't know this until I saw your film a couple of years ago, and that is that George W. Bush became the 43rd president of the United States of America, went missing for the time period that JFK Jr.'s plane went down near Martha's Vineyard, and he was unaccountable for several days. And this is an extraordinary thing historically to happen. Do you want to talk about that, John? And our listeners are fascinated by this.
I absolutely do. Well, and let me say that if you want to pay for it, you can pay for the assassination of JFK Jr., but you can also find it. Any number of people have posted it.
If people can afford it, they should pay for it. Now, I say this all the time on the program. Independent filmmakers like John Hankey, to make future projects work, depend on some help. If you can afford to pay the $20, which is about £13 sterling, buy it. Get on to thedarklegacy.com, bushkilljfk.com, and bloody well buy it. If you can't afford to watch it, well, you might find it on a certain social media site. But buy the bloody film if you can do, because that's how people like John Hankey make films going forward. And I think it's a magnificent film, by the way, and I recommend it.
And it's also available on Netflix and Hulu. I mean,
is it on Netflix? I didn't know it was on Netflix. There you
it's
are.
on Netflix.
I didn't even know that. I cannot know. I'm
me
thrilled.
neither.
What's going on, John? There's somebody
but
within
I'll
the
tell you what,
system.
if you go to Amazon and write it a review, you don't, go watch it on social media and then go to Amazon and write a review. I'll be very grateful if you do that much.
But $20
you were asking
is
a really good question.
Yeah,
I have forgotten what it is.
It's this incredible reality that George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker, wasn't developed amnesia, doesn't have a clue where he was on November the 22nd, 63. And I learned through watching your outstandingly researched film, by the way, that W, 43 himself, went missing for a few days, totally unaccountable, around about the time that JFK Jr.'s plane went down. Amazing. Talk about that. Explain that to our listeners.
Well, where to begin? One of the things, the reason that I made JFK 2, also known as Dark Legacy, was because I had come to the point in my research. There's, this overwhelming amount of evidence that John Kennedy Jr. was murdered, but there is not an overwhelming amount of evidence about who killed him or who would want to kill him. And so I don't know if you can imagine, but I felt like I was carrying an enormous burden around, that I had the evidence of this crime and I didn't have a clue about where to point it. And I had heard several years before that Hoover had written this memo naming Bush Sr., and I was aware of a good deal of the evidence connecting Bush Sr. to E. Howard Hunt and the evidence connecting E. Howard Hunt to the grassy knoll. But I'm stewing over all of this, and I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and my brain was screaming at me, the father killed the father, and the son killed the son. And so then it just so happened that I had access to this Dow Jones news retrieval program that I don't know if it exists anymore, and I couldn't possibly have afforded to pay for it. I got it donated. And as a teacher, I received this as a donation anyway. I Googled or did the search to try to find out where Bush was that day. And let me make the long story short, which is to say that the media reporters ran to the Bush campaign because Al Gore had given a speech and said, "I'm not going to campaign this weekend out of respect for John Kennedy Jr." And so reporters ran to the Bush campaign to get an answer, and they couldn't get one because he wasn't there. And they asked Karen Hughes, his campaign director, where he was, and she said she didn't know. And they asked her when he would be back, and she said that she didn't know. Now, this is, in terms of the electoral process, this is the equivalent of 6 months ago, last July.
Unheard of.
Right down. Right now, last July, people were talking about the fact that Bush was nowhere in the polls. Last July, if you were behind in Iowa and behind in New Hampshire, you were in trouble. People were talking about it. And so here we have a very key electoral weekend, and Bush has just disappeared. Absolutely. And I could go on and on about that because I'll talk about it. The report came out that he was he was seen late Saturday night. The plane went down Friday night, and they stalled. That's the real key evidence, is that they stalled. They prevented the Coast Guard or anybody else from going into the crash area. Now, they knew where the plane went down instantaneously for any number of reasons, right? There's 4 or 5 different, of course they have backups. What do you call them?
Yeah. Well,
you have backup systems just in case one fails. I'm trying to remember the word redundant. Redundancy built into the system. And so there were 4 or 5 backed up redundancies all screaming at the FAA that the plane had gone down. And they knew the precise location. I had the head of the Coast Guard in California told me they knew within 3 feet where the plane had gone down. That their ability to triangulate was that precise. And yet they delayed. They kept the Coast Guard. They prevented the Coast Guard. They ordered. There's video in the movie. You get to hear a Civil Air Patrol captain saying that they told him, "Stay the hell out of the crash area. You are to stay over dry land."
That's right.
All right. Anyway.
Hey John, let's bring our listeners up to speed. We're assuming knowledge here. John Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn were heading to a wedding on Martha's Vineyard on Friday the 16th of July 1999. He was piloting the small plane that went down. He was a very proficient pilot, a very good pilot. This is what John Hankey, who I'm thrilled is on the programme, is telling us about. And the bizarre circumstances around the crash, the technical things, the Coast Guard telling people to stay away from the area, all of that. All of this is true. As I said, it's in the documentary, The Assassination of JFK Jr. Loads of tweets about this, but I'm not going to read them, John. I'm going to get out of your way, but I just wanted to remind people, this is how he died. This guy who launched George magazine, this incredibly good-looking, charismatic, 39-year-old man, as bright as a button, undoubtedly was going to make a big political move in the very near future. Wiped out in this plane crash in 1999 with all sorts of bizarre, as I said, and very, very, very strange circumstances. So carry on, my friend. Just wanted to just put that out there because we will have listeners listen to this and they won't remember this. It's incredible because we don't talk about JFK Jr. We just don't. I don't know why that is, but we don't. Anyway, you were talking about the fact that the redundancy systems didn't work. There were a number of reasons why they should have been able to identify the exact place the plane went down. The Coast Guard was telling people to stay away from it, and you left it there. Go ahead.
The FAA would have received a notification before the plane hit the water. I believe it was the guy whose name is on the NTSB report told me that the and why he didn't investigate it, I don't know. Why it didn't raise any red flags with him, I don't know. He seemed like a perfectly honest guy, but anyway, who knows? The point is that if they didn't send any search and rescue craft into the crash area for 15 and a half hours, that should be a screaming red light to people. They said that he didn't have a flight instructor on the plane, and there's not an ounce of evidence to support that allegation. Today, there's not an ounce of evidence to support the allegation that there was no flight instructor on the plane. And there were, I think in the video, I list 6 very, very, very concrete reasons why John would have had a flight instructor. One of them is that he always, this was a relatively new plane. It was very, very powerful in terms of its capabilities, and he needed someone to teach him all the bells and whistles. I mean, right, anybody who has a computer knows that it's capable of doing about 90,000 more things than you are familiar with. And if this is an airplane, it's not quite so comfortable to ignore the capabilities of your instrument as with a plane as it is with a computer. In any case, he would absolutely have had one. He always had one. He had broken his foot a couple of months before, and he had just had the cast off, but he was on crutches. And in that situation, of course, you would have somebody to assist you. It would have been very, very painful for him to maneuver the plane on the ground where you use foot pedals. In the air, it wouldn't have been a problem whatsoever. But on the ground, it would have been an enormous inconvenience and genuine pain to him to have to maneuver the plane. But to me, the screaming one is that he had never flown without a flight instructor before, and secondly, that they made the announcement that there was no flight instructor on the plane without, I'm telling you, without a shred of evidence to substantiate that, and yet they're handing it out to you like it's gospel. We were talking about how George W. went missing, and I have to say this, and I've made a note to myself to say it, and I'm going to stick it in here. One of the big differences between the death of John Kennedy Jr. and the death of John Kennedy Sr. is that you could spend a lifetime reading all of the pertinent documentation in regard to the death of John Kennedy Sr., millions of pages. And I mean, I'm just stunned at how every day I find something very, very relevant that I'd never heard of before that, has enormous importance in terms of interpreting that event. Whereas with John Kennedy Jr., it's a much, much shorter stack. And if you work hard in 6 months, I think you can probably get through every single page that is of any relevance, whatever. One of the things, it's my particular interpretation. And if you stop for a minute and, let's take a mental break for a second and back away from the subject and say, suppose you're the head of the mafia And suppose your job is to engage in various sorts of illegal activity, including murder, but, not necessarily principally murder, but occasionally somebody needs to get taken out. But almost always you're involved in some sort of, shady business or other. And in any case, you don't want people to know about the legitimate things that you're involved in. How can you work with anybody, given that the police are going to offer amnesty or bribes or any number that the police are going to be able to? Suppose they catch one of your lieutenants in the commission of one of these crimes and they tell them, look, we're going to put you in jail or you're going to be state's witness. Which is it? Well, how do you deal with that? And I think that is a question that the ruling elites have faced for thousands of years. And I could give you an example, but I won't. But
why not?
Certainly, right? I'm sorry?
Why not? Give us an example.
Not Constantine, Diocletian, I think, the son of Constantine, slaughtered. You may not know this, but Roman emperors, in fact, were elected. They had to stand up in front of the public and be acclaimed. The people got to vote by acclamation, and if the cheers didn't overcome the boos, you were in trouble. And the Romans were very careful to always choose somebody who was popular and well regarded and well equipped. But in this particular situation, it wasn't the case. And it was in the Hippodrome. It was in Constantinople, and in the Hippodrome, and the guy got booed, and he ran back. And the official story is that his wife's, and he ran back and started packing his bags. And the official story, you'll find this, and I think it's in somebody in the church must have written it. I don't know. One of the official scorekeepers wrote the story how he came back and said, oh man, we got to beat it out of town. And his wife said, oh hell no, I like wearing purple. Kill them all. And when they were, which they did, right? They surrounded the Hippodrome and they killed all of the opponents, the opposition who were, meeting and rallying and whatnot. In the Hippodrome, they killed them. I think it's like 60,000 people. And I have encouraged my students to count out 60,000 grains of rice sometime and see what a pile of dead bodies that is. In any case, when it was over, did Diocletian build a monument to his wife? No, he built a monument to the Pope. He built the Hagia Sophia, which is, I think, by all regards, the greatest church in the world, the most beautiful. I mean, it makes St. Peter's look like a square building, which I guess it is, right? The Hagia Sophia is really, really magnificent. And I believe it's taller than and bigger than St. Peter's, but I don't know, and it's not worth quibbling about. I take that to say that it was the Pope and his people who said, look, you go in and kill them, and we will have the priest go into church in the morning and tell them how all those people were godless, communists or whatever word they used for them in those days, but the baby-eating, horrible, God deniers, and we had to wipe them out, and so we did, and people should praise you for doing it rather than condemn you for doing it. Anyway, the point is that this kind of such leaders have had to face the question and the problem for a long time of how can we trust the people that we let into the inner circle and let them know about, 9/11, for example, right? The people who are in on the innermost detail of the Kennedy assassination. How do we know that those people won't rat us out eventually? How do we avoid that? And I think the answer, the mafia has come up with the answer. And I don't think that the mafia came up with the answer. I think that the mafia has published the answer that the Romans probably came up with, which is that you don't let somebody in the inner circle until they have committed a murder for you. And the mafia calls it making your bone. And
that's right.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I'm fascinated. That's right. Anybody who's read Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi or any of these, whistleblower books by guys who went into the witness protection program, you're absolutely right to say that. And this will be fascinating now to many of our listeners, the idea that, a future president would be would be invited to or incited to commit a murder before getting, access to the kingdom or the keys to the kingdom. And of course, that's where we were going with this. We got 21 minutes to the top of the hour, so we got probably about 18 minutes, maybe 15 minutes left on this. And that's where we're going with this. What would George W. Bush have to gain by participating in the murder of John F. Kennedy Jr.? And of course, I've seen the film, and I recommend it. I'm going to say it again: The Assassination of JFK Jr. Go to thedarklegacy.com if you can afford to buy it. Do that. But talk about that. So it's not a case of Bush thinking, well, in 4 years' time, I might have to face Kennedy, or anything else. It's as dark and as satanic and as evil as that, John. You to get into the kingdom, to see the abyss, to look into the abyss, basically, you're going to have to do this one thing.
Yes, it's you're going to have to do this one thing, right? It's
not an invitation to doing it. It's an instruction, basically.
And if you say no, you're now privy, and you've said no. You know what I mean? I think that there's a threat inherent in the offer that you have to take. It's an offer you can't refuse. And I don't mean to suggest by any means that George W. Bush was given any position of responsibility. But let me go back for just a second, and because it struck me, without knowing hardly any of the details of Bush's activities on the day of the Kennedy assassination, that his political career started the day after the Kennedy assassination. And that is not an exaggeration. It might be by 1 or 2 days, perhaps. But that he became a political candidate immediately after the Kennedy assassination. And it's the 2 and 2 that I put together is that was him getting his ticket punched. That was him becoming a made man, and that his political career was looked after from that point on.
It's very important, by the way. It's very important to just repeat something you said for our listeners. John isn't saying that Bush became a powerful man and, somebody incredibly important in the inner echelons of the inner circle by becoming president. He didn't. He was a puppet like any other. But we're harking back to what John said about you're buying Bush's silence. Isn't that right, John? In the future. It's more about the fact that he's going to see, hear, witness things that ordinary men and women are not privy to, and by in insisting on him being involved in the assassination of Kennedy Jr., well, then you've bought his silence forever, and of course you've bought his complicity in the things that you instruct him to do and the policies you instruct him to to promote in the time that he's president.
That's right. And I think you made the point that it doesn't make him a powerful person.
No.
It makes him, in fact, what it does is it welds the puppeteer's strings to his soul, which is to say, we have you for murder. You can't dare cross us because we have you for murder. Now, let me tell people that if they go to bushkilljfk.com, you will see things that you can't see in a video. This has been on my to-do list for a couple of years, but I just, I have a big and important to-do list. Anyway, the evidence is that Bush was arrested as a shooter coming out of the Daltex building. And I don't want to go off and down that road, but he was in Dealey Plaza almost without a doubt. And like I said, we have other issues to deal with, and we could easily spend 18 minutes on that one. And all the details are laid out at the website, bushkilljfk.com. So go there and when you have some time, and take your time.
There's a photograph, John. Isn't there a photograph of H.W. Bush as obviously a younger man?
There's a photograph that looks as much like my dad as it looks like George H.W. Bush. And I know for a fact that E. Howard Hunt had a double on the scene. And I suspect that George H.W. had a double on the scene. And if I were George H.W. and had been arrested coming out of the Daltex building and got walked into the police department and then walked out the back door and put into a police car, and Garrison talks about this. Garrison didn't know it was Bush, but he talks about this guy's arrest and the significance, the importance of this guy's arrest. I would not have then gone back to the Daltex building and to the book depository and been hanging around, because they're just a few yards away from each other, 50, 60 yards away from each other. And it was the crowd according to Roger Craig, the policeman of the year and Jim Garrison's best friend, Roger Craig says that it was the crowd that arrested this individual who came running out of the Daltex building and handed him over to the police. Well, the crowd was very liable to still be around. So if I were him, I wouldn't have been standing in front of the police depository. But who knows? It might be him, and it looks something like him. But like I said, there's also E. Howard Hunt, without question, had a look-alike on the scene.
You know something, John? You know, people listening to this, and I know this because we go out on commercial radio, and I know there are people listening to this and think this is absolutely crazy. This is crazy stuff, they'll say.
Oh, it is, absolutely.
There's it's insane. And yet, some of them won't be aware that H.W.'s father, W's grandfather, with the Union Banking Company, of course, was a funder and a collaborator with the Nazis, knowing full well who these people were and what they were doing. And it doesn't get any more evil or any more sickening than that. And it's not a leap, is it? It's not a leap to think that Bush Sr. was involved in the Kennedy assassination and Jr. was involved in paying somebody or setting somebody to the task of murdering JFK Jr. To me, it's not a crazy leap. I can see it. It's terrifying, isn't it? But I can see it. I actually can see it. And when I saw the documentary, it made a lot of sense to me. As subjective as it is, it did make a lot of sense.
I was wrestling with all of this for the longest time when I had this epiphany in the middle of the night. But if it were remotely obvious who else you could point a finger at, well, I would be pointing a finger at those people. Now, so let's take that up for just a second. Although there is another topic, I want to bring up Jeb Bush before we finish. Anyway, you said that John Kennedy was considering running for political office.
He was, yeah.
No, it's my considered judgment that he absolutely was not.
You think he wasn't? You think Junior wasn't thinking about politics?
No, I believe what he said, which he said on numerous occasions. And there are at least two main points. And one is that he said that he was very happy publishing George Magazine. Yeah. And in George Magazine, I mean, let me give the audience a hint as to why he might say such a thing. He published an article by Oliver Stone about how the French had exhumed Napoleon and discovered that the British had poisoned Napoleon using arsenic. They found it in his hair. You won't find that on the front page of the New York Times, but you'd find it in George Magazine. And in the process, in the article, there's one sentence, and I guess it's only a clause of a sentence, in which he says, well, you know, some people say, how can you suggest that the British would do such a thing? And Stone says, well, it's very standard for governments to assassinate political leaders. They do it all the time. They did it when they killed John Kennedy. He published that. John Kennedy Jr. published that. And any number of people might have thought that was crazy and reckless, and it was crazy and reckless, but enormously brave. And, I can't think that he didn't recognize the risk that he was taking in doing it, but he did it. And he did it obviously because he thought it was important. He also, and this is also in the video, he published a lengthy article by the mother of the young man who was in prison for shooting Yitzhak Rabin.
That's right, he did. That's right. Yeah.
Outlining evidence that the Mossad killed Yitzhak Rabin, not her son, and that her son was a tool of the Mossad, but that he hadn't fired the fatal shot and couldn't have fired the fatal shot.
Jesus, John, you're right, and that's making serious enemies, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. One, and it's also a reason to think that you have a serious purpose in publishing this magazine. You're not there twiddling your thumbs, passing time, waiting to run for office. You're doing what you're about to do. Listen,
I got to bow to your superior knowledge, and you might very well be right. He might have been, amongst his circle of friends and colleagues, he might very well have been adamant that he wasn't going to run. I suppose I should have qualified what I was trying to say. I think he would have been under enormous pressure to run, John, because he was because he was gorgeous. I mean, listen, I'm as straight as a die. The man was absolutely magnetic. He was incredibly good looking, charismatic. Of course, he supported his uncle Ted and gave him all the support in the world, and probably saw himself as being a support to Ted Kennedy going forward. But he would have been under some pressure to run because he would have been eminently electable, wouldn't he?
Well, and of course, he got asked the question every single time he gave an interview.
That's right. Anytime
and
he
he
went
started
out,
to get a little. You can see that he's a little bit exasperated by it. But the other thing that he said, right? So there's 2 points that he makes. One is, I'm not doing nothing in publishing George Magazine. This is my mission in life, and I'm doing it. One. And two, he said, if I ever were to run for political office, one of the things that he had learned, he said, from Joe Kennedy, his cousin, Robert's oldest son, from his life was that if you want to run for public office, he said that running for public office is like going to war. And you better be ready to go to war. You better have your personal life completely in order before you go to war. And I can tell you that he did not have his personal life completely in order, right? His relationship with his wife was stormy enough that he spent the night at a hotel. The night before he died, he spent at a hotel. And the descriptions that I get from sources that I trust is that they were fighting. And my guess would be that they were fighting over the issue of having a kid. But because, anyway, I won't go into all of that.
He was a Kennedy and he probably had tastes as well. I mean, who knows? This is the thing, you know.
I don't believe any of that stuff.
No.
I think all of that. I think all of the stuff about Kennedy having sex out of marriage is done by the killers. And of course it would be. Right? You can't believe it unless you have really, really stark evidence of it. You can't accept any of that because, of course, the killers would be spreading that sort of disinformation around.
Are we talking about father or son now?
Any of them.
I don't know, John, because a lot of his closest friends. Yeah, let's not go. Yeah, we don't have time anyway.
I want to go down.
Okay, fair enough.
What I want to say is that
yeah.
He said it over and over and over, and I don't think that he was the skilled liar that his father was. I think that he was a very, very honest. I believe him when he said it, and it clearly his personal life was not in order. His relationship with his wife. I don't know about you, but I have fights with my wife, and I occasionally have to sleep on the couch or something.
Indeed, yeah, we've all been there.
It happens. It's part of being a human being.
We've all been there.
And maybe they didn't have a couch or whatever. Anyhow, it's. I don't mean to make a big deal out of it, other than to say, I don't believe he was planning to run for political office. He had innumerable opportunities to say so, and he was always emphatic that he was not. And if you're the killers, you have to offer up somebody for people to point their fingers at. And the person that people point their fingers at is Hillary Clinton. And they say, oh, he was going to run for Senate in New York, and Hillary didn't want to lose to him, which, of course, she would have. And so they killed him. And, you know, I have 100 reasons for saying that I don't believe that, but I'd rather talk about Jeb. I guess we should spend a minute and let you have a comeback or two on Hillary, but I don't think that the Clintons were involved in murdering John Kennedy Jr. when Edward Kennedy woke Clinton up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Or actually, he woke Podesta up at 6, and Podesta woke up Clinton, and Clinton called the Air Force and said, they didn't have planes in the air, right? This is now 9 hours later, and they didn't have a plane in the air. They didn't,
no.
And so Clinton made a phone call, and they filled the skies full of planes. They just kept them out of the crash area. Anyway, go ahead, but I want us to come to...
No, I don't disagree with anything you said there about the Clintons. I really don't. I am mindful of the fact, John, is that we have about 90 seconds left before we have to wrap this up. It's flown
90
by.
seconds.
I'm going to give you those 90 seconds.
Give me 90 seconds. Jeb Bush was in Charleston, South Carolina, 2 blocks away from the shooting that took place. 2 blocks away from the shooting that took place where they killed Clementa Pinckney. It's not on my website. This is brand new stuff. Pinckney. He was a state senator. He was one of the most phenomenal politicians you will ever see video of. He was Jesus, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King combined, and he had an edge on all of them in terms of his winning personality and his articulateness and his genuine really love-filled heart and devotion to truth and justice. And he was the shooter shows up and asks for him, shows up at the moment that he can. Right? If he showed up an hour or 15 minutes earlier or 15 minutes later, he wouldn't have got to kill him. He shows up at the minute, walks in, he asks for him, he walks in, it's the first guy that he kills. Anyway, I could go on and on and on.
That's amazing, by the way. If anybody wants to find out more about that, you need only put Clementa C. Pinckney into a search engine, and you can read about it. Of course, he died last summer, didn't he? He was murdered last summer. We didn't do very much about that on the programme, it has to be said. But it's amazing you're dropping that name in there.
Right.
John,
Jeb Bush is 2 blocks away. I'm sorry.
No. It's fascinating. What I'm going to say is I'm going to recommend people go to bushkilljfk.com. I want to extend you an invitation to come back on the programme next month, but to spend the whole show with me. It's a 2-hour show, but we'll do the whole show, you and I, and you'll have plenty more time to get into some of these areas, John, because we only had nearly 50 minutes tonight, which is a lot on radio, but when it comes to this particular subject, we could have spent more time on it. Bushkilljfk.com, folks. You'll find links there to where to buy the DVDs. You've been listening to John Hankey. He's a teacher, he's a journalist, he's a filmmaker. These are great films, and I'm telling you, The Assassination of JFK Jr., JFK 2 itself, 2 separate films. These are films you have to see. You really do. John, thanks for coming on, my friend. Sorry it's ending abruptly like that, but believe me when I say you've got an open invitation to come back on the programme for a longer stint real soon.
I had a great time. I really appreciate the offer.
Well, it was an honour having you on, my friend. Thanks for doing it, and let's get together real soon. John Hankey on the line to us there from his home.